After doing a video covering the Buster AoE archers and ranking them in order of how good I thought they were, it only seemed to make sense that we move over to Buster AoE Sabers, as we do have 5-star Buster AoE Sabers in Artoria, Ibuki, Mordred, Altera, and Arthur. While there are some very good 4-star AoE Sabers, especially in the Buster category, we just don't have enough time to really cover all of them in one video. I would like to at least go to bed at a reasonable hour tonight, and so you'll just have to settle for the 5 stars. Now, if there is another topic like this that you would like me to cover, by all means, leave it in the comments down below, and I'll be sure to get around to it. And if you enjoy these types of videos, they do take a little bit more work than a little bit of scripting, so I would really appreciate it if you could drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed. But with that being said, let us not dilly-dally anymore. Let us just start moving into this, starting off with the 5th place spot. Psych, you thought there was no way I was going to be doing a video about Buster AoE Sabers and not at least giving an honorable mention to Saber Alter, who is arguably a 5-star AoE Buster Saber in disguise. Now, you may not see it right now on the NA side of things, but she has a buff that is coming up in the future that makes her an absolute monster. Not only does she already do very good damage thanks to her higher than usual damage scaling on her NP, but this buff in particular not only gives her the 3 times for 3 turns buff for her mana burst, which yes, does actually allow you to stack it if you're using Koyenskaya, but they allow her to also not just refund enough to do Buster farming, but I guess enough to really do whatever you want, because she gains a buff that whenever she attacks with her Buster cards, which, go figure, her NP is a Buster card, she gains 10% NP per enemy she hits. So if there's 3 enemies in a node, she refunds 30% on top of the 10% that she has on her overcharge abilities. And yes, this can stack with Koyenskaya, meaning you can see some ridiculous nonsense like a Buster Servant refunding 70% of their NP. It is downright disgusting, some of the stuff you can do with Saber Alter. And so while she doesn't have this buff on the NA side yet, there has to be some kind of honorable mention before making this video, because I do think I messed up in not doing an honorable mention for Arash in the Buster AoE Archers. Even though it is just supposed to be 5 stars, sometimes you just have a unit that, despite not having that 5-star rarity, breaks the mold. And functionally, to all of us that are playing the game, they are just 5 stars in our hearts. So, had to give a shout out to Saber Alter before we actually start moving into this video properly. Alright, this is going to surprise nobody that Arthur is at the number 5 spot, because what does this guy do correct at all whatsoever? It is super unfortunate for me, because I love Arthur. He is one of my favorite servants, period, in all of Type Moon. The fact that he is a non-grand servant that has the title of a beast hunter is really cool. I mean, he's doing the jobs of more powerful servants despite him being a normal guy himself. I mean, that's kinda crazy, and it's really cool. Not to also mention, Prototype is one of the cooler Fate works. You just have a whole bunch of crazy stuff going on. And so when they finally dropped Arthur, I was super excited to get this guy, only to learn that after all of his buffs, he's still not very good. I mean, his base damage is not super great. His super large power mod, which is his whole gimmick, gives him decent enough damage. I mean, sure, he's out damaging Ibuki with Undead, and he's now out damaging normal Artoria, but one thing that I forgot about is that he doesn't have a 30% battery, and unlike all of the other Artorias and even Mordred, he doesn't refund on his own NP, so the guy can't Buster loop normally. You have to do some really weird setups with him if you actually want to get him to loop, and it's way more trouble than it's worth. Unironically, the best thing he might have going for him is the second skill, because it gives him a 50% crit damage buff and it bombs 30 stars. So you know what? He can do some decent enough crit damage. Bring Merlin, which isn't even his Merlin, right? You gotta bring the wrong Merlin with him. Slap on hero creation and maybe just obliterate the enemies. But I was done coping on this unit whenever I brought them to the Koyenskaya raid, because she's super large. You know, you figure Arthur, this is your time to shine, and he couldn't even 3-turn the thing, but Melusine could. I understand she has the, non-Hominidae servant thing going for her, but dude, this is your thing. It's a giant beast, and you're not able to take care of it. I mean, they even gave him the flat-out 3-turn Buster buff. Normally, for someone like, say, Mordred or even for Saber Alter, they gave them the 3 times for 3 turns to balance them out, but for Arthur, they said, hey buddy, you take as much as you want. You have it for free for 3 turns, because you're not doing any damage otherwise. You'd think they'd be on the right track, because you look at his overcharge, he gives himself NP damage, but one, it is a pitiful 10%, and it doesn't even stack. Maybe if his NP damage stacked, he'd have like some weird kind of niche with Oberon, because, he's building up NP damage, but Altera and Artoria already do that better, and I mean, their base damage is already way better than this guy, so it is way too much trouble for what it's worth and what you get in return, which again, is super unfortunate considering how cool Arthur is, and how important of a servant he is in kind of like the greater Type Moon franchise, I guess if you want to call it that, but it's unfortunate. Bad base damage, the buffs, not super great. They didn't really address any of the issues. A power mod that, sure, you could go for it and get some decent damage, but you still gotta bend over backwards if you want to use them in Buster farming anyway. So, yeah, I don't think anybody's surprised that this guy's ending up in last place, which is really unfortunate. 4th place was also probably going to be obvious because Altera over here is kind of the bare necessities of what you need to do to be considered a decent Buster farmer. And that doesn't mean that she's bad, it's just, again, unfortunate that she's being compared with some of the other servants that are going to be on this list. Because when I say she has the bare minimum, I mean, she's doing a lot of very good things. She has a very solid attack buff, she has the 30% battery, she can do some pretty decent crits, not anything super insane, but she's got crit damage there going for her, and she has NP damage on her first skill that, again, you can loop back with Koya and Skya, and that plays very, very nicely with Oberon. Not to also mention that she can remove the enemy's defensive buffs, which is kind of nice going into challenge quests, especially when she can also kind of stack defense downs on the enemies, because if you're firing subsequent NPs on, say, a big boss, you will do more and more damage. Unfortunately, it doesn't proc first, which would probably help her out a little bit if you were going to be using her as a farmer, but there really is nothing wrong with Altera. I mean, sure, if you wanted her to, say, have more stuff, you could say, can you give her some survivability for, challenge quests and whatnot, but overall, I really don't have anything that I really despise about Altera. I think she's just kind of doing everything rather well. It's just unfortunate because originally when the game dropped, the dynamic was, well, Altera doesn't have a battery or anything, but she does the most damage. And then Artoria doesn't hit as hard, and neither does Mordred, but they've got like a power mod, or they just have a really good battery that is allowing them to be a bit more consistent. I mean, you see this dynamic everywhere in early FGO. Drake and Iskandar also have this, where Drake doesn't do as much damage, but she has a very large 50% battery to help her be a bit more consistent, whereas Iskandar does a ton more damage, but has no battery, so it was a bit better if you had, say, a max limit broken K-scope or something along those lines. And it's just, unfortunately, even though Altera is one of the main villains in Extella, which I personally really, really like, it seems she's not been forgotten and left on the wayside, because they did give her everything they need. It's just, I guess she can't really compete with Artoria kind of being one of the faces of the Fate franchise, and so if they're going to give somebody, another buff to kind of make them shine and be really good in the meta, it's probably going to go to Artoria, but not Altera. And again, there's nothing wrong with Altera. If you're somebody that likes to use their Altera, by all means, she's not bad. It's just, she's not got the other bells and whistles that some of the other guys have. I think in the future, if they wanted to give her, say, an anti-man or maybe an anti-sky or something along those lines power mod, I think that kind of could work with her being the White Titan. I mean, taking out other gods and stuff surely would work for an anti-sky power mod, but if you wanted her to be a bit more meta, I'm sure you could find a reason to give her the Earth power mod, or the man one for that matter. Really, anything I think would work out really well, and that could give her the edge she needs to be maybe 3rd or 2nd place, or potentially even take the crown for herself if they give her a dummy nutty buff like they did for Constantine, but as of right now, she's going to sit comfortably at 4th place. And what I mean by Altera missing some of the bells and whistles that these other servants have can be seen by third place Mordred, who quite literally almost has Altera's same kit, but she just does a little bit higher normal damage and has a power mod over Altera, which again, the Arthur slash Artoria power mod, whatever you want to call it, may not be the most prevalent thing, but it is a gimmick that Altera just doesn't have. That on top of having higher base damage, she also just has a gimmick that will come up that Altera really can't match because she doesn't really have a gimmick or a niche to really speak of. On top of that, you can't see something like Mordred's lack of survivability as something that Altera can profit from because Altera also doesn't have anything for survivability. Mordred also has a buff that I believe drops with Lilim Harlot next year in about April for us that made her mana burst, instead of it being 1 turn, it's 3 times for 3 turns, which is really good, 30% extra buster crit damage, and then a 20% self-attack buff, which is why her base damage is so good, plus it's stackable if you're using double Koyanskaya. Ignore my gameplay in the background, the only reason things are a little bit weird is that I ran out of Dragon Fangs when trying to level up my Mordred's first skill, so she's not able to quite loop it back on the third wave. That's not a dig on her, you know, that's just, unfortunately I don't have the Dragon Fangs, but she is able to loop it back still right now on the NA side of things. You would just pop it on wave 2, and then, you know, you'd use the Buster Mana Burst again on wave 3, but it's even better on JP because you not only loop the Buster buff, so you have 100%, because now it's, again, 3 times for 3 turns, but you also have a 40% attack buff, which is really strong going into the final wave. Plus, she has all the base essentials that you would want her to have. She has the 30% battery, she can bomb some stars, not a whole lot, but then give herself 3 times a 50% crit damage buff, so if you use those on the Buster cards, they're really going to have a nasty bite to them. And then she has some extra bells and whistles, like being able to debuff cleanse herself, having 50% defense for 1 turn, which isn't survivability, but it is nice. And then she also has the Artoria gimmick where she refunds 20% NP gauge on her overcharge, which again was the reason why Artoria was still able to farm for the few weeks before we got Oberon. You know, it makes them really nice as 30% battery servants that can use stuff like cranking. It's just very, very useful for them to be able to do that. And overall, Mordred is just kind of a more solid version of Altera. You could maybe argue that Altera has a little bit of an edge because she has NP damage, which helps her to interact with Oberon's third skill a little bit better, but more times than not, you're probably going to prefer Mordred for the higher base damage, the ability to stack the massive buster damage, and the attack buff, plus having a power mod that's not the largest in the game, but you know, usually we run into an Artoria or an Arthur, you know, every now and then. You might find them in every other event at the very least. I mean, again, it's Arthur and Artoria. I mean, they're like the poster children of Fate. Well, more so Artoria, but you get what I mean. Now, second place might be my nuclear take, because second place being Ibuki over Mordred is probably going to have some people upset. Maybe it's more understandable, you know, if it's on the NA side of things where she doesn't have her skill 1 buff, but I am considering buffs that we have over on the JP side of things, and I still find myself reaching for Ibuki a little more frequently than my Mordred. And there are a few elements to that. One, her base damage is not that much lower than Mordred's anyway. Sure, with the Artoria or the Arthur power mod, she does heavily outdamage Ibuki, but the Undead power mod is not an uncommon thing that you will see in free quest farming. Think of it like Mordred's going to be better for, say, some wave 3s if you happen to just have an Artoria or an Arthur, but in general, fighting like the random ghosts, the skeletons, and all these other guys, these kind of common trash mobs, I mean, even the Black Samurai guys that we got in Shimosa, these guys appear in free quests with some regularity. And you can always be assured that whenever Halloween rolls around, you know, she's going to be pretty good against the pumpkin guys, which is probably why I find myself going for Ibuki a little bit more frequently. Sure, the niche is a bit more common, it doesn't do as much damage though, but that commonality is why I'm more going for her. The 50% battery is also nice, even though Mordred technically also has a 50% battery. Having access to that immediately on a skill and being able to loop it back is very, very helpful. It especially does come up in more CQ situations where I am kind of considering Ibuki a little bit more because she does have the extremely powerful effect of being able to pierce not only invincibility, but to also pierce defense, meaning that Ibuki realistically cannot be stopped when it comes to challenge quests. She is going to smack them in the face with the Kusanagi blade, and she's going to be stacking 20% Buster down for 3 turns on them as well. So with a 50% battery plus double Koyenskaya, or even Koyenskaya plus like an Oberon and a Waver, you can feed a lot of NP into her to allow her to consistently NP, where she will build up very, very good damage over time. In fact, you could argue that if you want to bring Ibuki and one of the other Buster AoE Sabers that were mentioned, she almost kind of acts like a support in that way, that she can offer them even more damage as well. So not only is she increasing her own damage, but she's making some of your other Sabers better by proxy of firing her NP, which is not that hard to do. Keeping in mind that she also does have her own decent Buster buff of 30%, which is technically 42% because of her Dragonkind EX passive skill that also gives her a little bit of DR, so she's kind of tanky, plus having a 30% defensive buff does mean that your Ibuki is going to be a little bit more sticky. And sure, someone like Mordred does have a 50% defensive buff, but I value my longevity because usually we're going to be in some of these fights from anywhere from 3 turns to maybe like 10 to 12 turns, depending on how nasty it's getting. And so having those skills that really help draw out the value of what you're getting, I value a little bit more. Plus, she has the same Star Bomb, and she has 50% free crit damage, which, again, I do value the 50% crit damage for 3 turns as opposed to 50% that's 3 times for 3 turns, because you can really blow through that very quickly. Especially if you get into a solo scenario where you just want to use Ibuki, you can really draw out the value of that 50% crit damage for 3 turns, as opposed to someone like a Mordred who finds herself in the same scenario would burn through that very, very quickly. And again, I just prefer having that guaranteed longevity a little bit more. Plus, hey, sealing the enemy's NP is technically more survivability than just a 50% defensive buff, because it can actually buy you that extra turn. So even though I think you could argue that Mordred could take the number 2 spot, I'm really not going to be upset at anybody if they say, nah, I like Mordred a little bit more. I just happen to slant a little bit more in the Ibuki direction. But realistically, if you wanted to shift them around from 2nd and 3rd place, I think this is the position that could kind of shift around a little bit, much like the last video where I think Napoleon and Ishtar could shift positions a little bit. It's very similar to that. I really wanted to find some way to make it to where Artoria was not in 1st place, but it is really undeniable how crazy this servant is. I mean, she has the most basic kit of all time. Go ahead, look at your Artoria, look at what she's doing. She's giving the party an attack buff, as a crazy 2nd skill that's giving her a Buster mana burst, and is giving her 30% NP damage. And then she has a 30% battery that also refunds 20% on her NP with no additional effects on that NP, by the way. Gives herself a couple of stars, and I guess if you really want to go big unga bunga, she changes all of her command cards to Buster whenever you pop the 2nd skill. But dude, her damage is redonkulous. I mean, the fact is, her base NP1 damage is closing in on Ibuki's power mod damage, which is a little bit ridiculous. She's only down by 4k, and she can do this on waves 1 and 3 if they start out really big. She can do it on 2 and 3. Doesn't really matter, right? She's going to be slam dunking somebody for a metric butt ton of damage. And like I said in the last video with Gilgamesh, sometimes you're just doing so much damage that it just doesn't matter. You are just an invaluable asset. I mean, there was a reason that even if people really like Herc or they really like Emiya when we got the free Fate Stay Night character, people were just taking Artoria. Not because Artoria is their favorite character, because she's a 5-star. But dude, she is an invaluable asset. She will dome everybody that gets in front of her because there's no power mod, which usually would kind of be a negative thing. You'd be like, oh man, I really want to have some kind of special gimmick, but not when you're doing power mod levels of damage for free, just whenever you want on whoever you want. Sometimes that gets a little bit ridiculous. And I was trying to find some angle where maybe Ibuki could be the best Saber because she has like really good applications going into challenge quests, but realistically, it's not like Ibuki has the most insane applications. Her NP is very good, but it's not like she's got hardline survivability or she's like really providing stuff for the entire party. Sure, you can get the Buster down on the NP, but that only helps you out if you also have additional Buster servants in your team comp, whereas Artoria, I've brought her to challenge quests and just domed people. Just Excalibured them 3 to 4 times and just moved about my day. I mean, Sometimes you can go into a challenge quest and try to pick apart all the little rules and stuff that they have going for you, or sometimes you can just dome them. Sometimes you can just smack them with a big gold beat stick and move about your day. And that's kind of what Artoria does, and she does a really good job at it. Sure, could she use some kind of invincibility, solemn defense, healing buff because she also has Avalon? Like, yeah, sure, maybe we could find some lore reason to give her something like that, but again, like Gilgamesh, you can kind of just bring them and get away with it in CQs because they just dome people for a ton of damage. And while maybe you could say, well, what if you want to get her into a solo capacity in a boss fight? I mean, none of the servants here are really good for solos. Ibuki might be the best, but she's still not exceptional. Again, no hardline survivability means as soon as you waste your Mystic Code invincibility or whatever, you're pretty much going to get booty blasted by an NP. So if you're going to get booty blasted anyway, might as well bring the biggest beat stick you have and chop them into little pieces. So yeah, I don't know if anybody was really surprised that she was going to be number one. Again, I tried, but it's kind of hard to not agree with the results where she is just doming people for a billion damage. If there's any other version of this video you'd like me to do, like, I don't know, like AoE quick lancers if we have enough of that, or something along those lines, leave that in the comments down below. I'd be excited to do some of these. These are very, very fun for me to do, even if they do take a little bit of work and do take me a couple of days to get done because I gotta actually level up my skills for some of my servants. But at the end of the day, I do think it is worth doing because, you know, I like fostering these discussions in the comments down below. Which again, if you think this video is completely wrong, go ahead and just drop that in the comments. Be like, ZTL, this was the dumbest video I've ever seen you make. Never upload ever again. I want you off YouTube. If that's your prerogative, go ahead and drop that in the comments down below. But with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. You guys have yourselves a nice day, and I'll catch y'all on the next one. Peace.